A crimson ribbon snaked across the parched earth, a grotesque garland leading straight to Tobias Hartwell's water well. 37 years on this godforsaken ranch had taught him the nuanced language of bloodstains, the rusty sprawl of a wounded deer, the thin, bright spray of a rabbit caught in a snare. This was neither. This was something else entirely, something that made the calloused hand gripping his rifle freeze as he rounded the corner of his weathered barn. There, crumpled against the rough-hewn stone wall of his well, lay a young Indian warrior. One hand, slick with fresh gore, pressed desperately against a gaping wound in his side. The other, an open claw of desperation, reached weakly toward the wooden bucket that hung just 3 feet above his head, an unreachable oasis. The man's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, each one a tortured symphony in the oppressive silence of the afternoon. Dark eyes, clouded with pain yet sharpened by an primal alertness, tracked Tobias's every movement, expecting death to descend from any shadow, any direction. This was 1847. A year that etched its name into the land with blood and dust, a year when the frontier was a raw, festering wound, and finding an Indian on your property meant one thing and one thing only, trouble. The kind of trouble that whispered of scalping in the dead of night, of homes engulfed in hungry flames, of bodies found mangled and desecrated. Every neighbor within 50 miles, every grizzled trapper and hardened pioneer, would offer the same grim counsel, delivered with a shake of the head and a spit of tobacco: put a bullet in the savage's head, Tobias. Bury him deep where no one will ever find the body. It's the only way. Tobias raised his rifle, the cold steel a familiar weight in his hands, his finger hovering over the trigger. The smart thing. The safe thing. The utterly, horrifyingly expected thing. But then, something in those dark, pain-haunted eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't just the raw agony he saw reflected there, though that was certainly present. It was something deeper, something that resonated with a forgotten tremor in his own soul. It was the same desperate, consuming thirst he'd known during the brutal drought of '44, when the very air had seemed to shrivel and crack, when 3 days without water had brought him to the brink of a death so parched and desolate, he could still taste the dust of it on his tongue. It was a universal human need, a primal urge that transcended the superficial divides of skin color, of guttural language, of which side of a senseless war you happened to be born into. The Indian tried to speak, his lips cracked and bleeding, a grotesque parody of a smile. But only a whisper, raspy and barely audible, escaped: water. Tobias lowered his rifle. The metallic click was deafening in the sudden stillness. His neighbors would call him a fool. His brother, back east, would undoubtedly declare he'd finally lost his mind to the desolate, soul-eating loneliness of the frontier. Hell, maybe they'd be right. But as he knelt beside this wounded stranger, the acrid scent of blood mingling with the dry earth, and pressed the rough wooden rim of the bucket to the man's lips, watching him drink like a man miraculously saved from a watery grave, a singular, undeniable truth settled deep within Tobias's bones. He was about to change both their lives forever. What Tobias couldn't possibly know, as the water sloshed and gurgled down the parched throat of the man before him, was that this wounded warrior wasn't just any member of the local tribes, a common raider or hunter. And what happened next would bring more riders to his isolated ranch than he'd ever seen in his entire solitary life. The Indian drank with a ravenous desperation that suggested days, perhaps weeks, without so much as a dewdrop. 3 full buckets, the water sluicing down his throat, before his trembling hands could finally hold the rim steady, the thirst momentarily slaked but the deeper wound still raw. Tobias watched every gulp, every convulsive swallow, his mind a whirlwind of implications. In this unforgiving territory, showing mercy to an Indian was not an act of kindness, it was a brazen invitation to certain death, a self-signed warrant for your own demise. But as a faint flush of color slowly, miraculously, returned to the warrior's gaunt face, Tobias noticed something that sent a new, colder kind of fear snaking through his veins. The wound in the man's side wasn't from an animal's claw, nor the jagged edge of a hunting accident. It was a bullet hole. Fresh. Still oozing a steady, horrifying trickle of blood. And judging by the precise angle, the telltale powder burns around the jagged edges, someone had shot him at close range. Very recent, very close range. Which meant, with a chilling certainty, whoever had done this might still be looking for him. Might be tracking that very same crimson trail that had led straight to Tobias's isolated ranch. Might be riding toward his property right now, with guns loaded, with questions Tobias couldn't answer, questions that could cost him everything. The Indian, sensing Tobias's spiraling fear, made a monumental effort. With a grunt of pain, he raised one hand, gnarled fingers pointing toward the hazy horizon, then drew a slow, deliberate cutting motion across his own throat. His message, etched in the universal language of survival, was chillingly clear: danger was coming. And soon. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Every primal instinct screamed at him: drag this wounded stranger away from your property. Hide the evidence. Pretend this never happened. Deny everything. But the man could barely sit up, let alone walk. Moving him now would likely be a death sentence, the jostling, the effort, too much for his ravaged body. And leaving him here, exposed and vulnerable, was like hanging a giant, blood-soaked target on both their backs. That's when Tobias heard it. The sound that had kept him alive through 12 years of brutal frontier living, the sound that whispered of peril and demanded immediate action. Hoofbeats in the distance. Multiple horses. Riding hard and fast. Coming straight toward his ranch. The Indian heard them too. His eyes, moments ago clouded with pain, went wide with what looked like genuine, abject terror. He tried to push himself up, pressing his back harder against the cold stone of the well, as if making himself smaller might somehow render him invisible. Blood immediately began seeping through his fingers where he pressed them against his wound, a fresh stain blooming against the already crimson-soaked buckskin. Tobias grabbed the empty bucket, a desperate, futile gesture, and doused the most prominent bloodstains as quickly as he could. But there was no time to truly clean it all, no time to erase the damning evidence. The riders would be here in minutes. Maybe less. He looked down at the wounded warrior, this stranger who had stumbled into his life and turned it irrevocably upside down in the span of a single, sun-drenched afternoon. A man whose very presence on his ranch could get them both killed, burned, scalped, annihilated. But whose dark eyes, even now, held something Tobias had never seen in an Indian before, not truly, not deeply. Gratitude. Pure, unadulterated, blinding human gratitude. The hoofbeats were closer now. Close enough to count them. 5 horses. Maybe 6. All moving at a desperate gallop that suggested they weren't coming for a friendly visit, not for a cup of coffee and a neighborly chat. Tobias made his choice in that split second, knowing, with a chilling certainty, it might be the last choice he ever made. He couldn't carry the wounded man. But he could hide him. The old root cellar behind the barn. If they could just make it that far. But as he reached down to help the Indian to his feet, the warrior grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, a grip like iron despite his injuries. He shook his head slowly, a grim, knowing negation. Then he did something that made Tobias's skin crawl, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He smiled. Not the grateful smile of a man being saved, not the weak, pained smile of someone accepting help. But the knowing smile of someone who understood, with a terrifying clarity, exactly who was coming over that hill. The riders crested the ridge like a malevolent storm cloud, bringing with them a silent, ominous lightning. 6 men on horseback, dust billowing behind them in an angry red haze, rifles glinting with predatory menace in the unforgiving afternoon sun. Tobias recognized the lead rider immediately, a knot forming in the pit of his stomach. Marshal Dixon Webb. A name whispered in fearful hushed tones from here to Santa Fe, a man whose reputation for casual violence and ruthless efficiency preceded him into every godforsaken town, every desolate ranch. Webb was the kind of lawman who shot first and asked questions later, especially when it came to Indian troubles. The kind who collected scalps as grisly trophies and called it justice. The kind who, without a second thought, would burn down an entire ranch, with everyone in it, if he even suspected them of harboring fugitives. Tobias stood squarely in front of the well, his body a flimsy shield, blocking the wounded Indian from view. He tried to look like a man who had nothing more pressing on his mind than fixing a broken fence post, his gaze fixed on some imaginary point on the horizon, his jaw set in a carefully neutral expression. His mouth felt like it was packed with desert sand, dry and gritty. Webb reined in his horse just 10 feet away, close enough that Tobias could see the cold, calculating glint in his pale blue eyes, eyes that missed nothing. The other 5 men fanned out in a menacing semicircle, hands resting with casual menace on their holstered weapons, on the polished stocks of their rifles. This wasn't a social call. Not even close. Afternoon, Hartwell. Webb's voice, a lazy, deceptive drawl, seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 unspoken threats, the chilling confidence of a man who knew, unequivocally, that he held all the cards. We're tracking a wounded Indian. Blood trail leads right to your property. Tobias felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cooling evening air. Haven't seen any Indians, Marshal. Been working on the south fence all day. He tried to keep his voice level, devoid of any betraying tremor. Webb's eyes, as sharp and predatory as a hawk's, swept across the ranch, taking in every minute detail. The man missed nothing. It's what made him so dangerous. His gaze lingered for a fraction of a second on the dark, damp stains in the dirt near the well, and Tobias felt his stomach plummet like a stone dropped down a deep crevice. Is that so? Webb dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements fluid and coiled, like a predator sizing up its prey. Because that sure looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. And unless you've been butchering cattle next to your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here recently. Behind Tobias, hidden by the rough stone wall of the well, the wounded Indian remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. But Tobias could feel the tension radiating from him, an almost palpable heat, like the oppressive warmth of a forge. One sound. One involuntary movement. And they were both dead men. Webb took 3 steps closer, his hand now resting openly on the butt of his pistol, a silent, deadly promise. You know what the penalty is for harboring Indian fugitives, don't you, Hartwell? It's the same penalty as for treason. A rope around the neck. Until dead. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, a chilling death sentence delivered with casual indifference. Tobias felt every muscle in his body coil tight, spring-loaded and ready. To fight. To run. Knowing, with grim certainty, that neither option would save them. Webb was too close now. Any sudden movement, any desperate lunge, would expose the Indian. And once that happened, once the hidden truth was revealed, bullets would start flying. That's when something impossible happened. The wounded Indian spoke. Not in English, not in the broken, hesitant phrases Tobias might have expected. But in his native tongue. A string of words that flowed like ancient music, clear and strong, despite his injuries, despite the searing pain that must have been tearing through his body. Words that made Marshal Webb freeze mid-step, his hand, moments ago so resolute on his pistol, fall away as if burned. The color drained from Webb's face like water from a broken bucket, leaving it a sickly, ashen gray. His mouth opened and closed, a silent gasp, like a fish desperately flopping for air. And when he finally found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper, choked and utterly disbelieving. Dear God, you're him. The other 5 riders, until now silent, menacing sentinels, immediately dismounted. Their weapons, moments ago so casually handled, were forgotten, their hands hanging limp at their sides. Their faces, hardened and weathered by years of violence, showed the same mixture of stark shock and something that looked almost, impossibly, like fear. But not the kind of fear men show when facing a dangerous enemy, when confronting an outlaw with a loaded gun. No. This was the kind of fear men show when they realize, with a sudden, gut-wrenching lurch, they've just made a terrible, terrible mistake. A mistake that could unravel their entire world. Webb turned to Tobias, his face now pale as fresh winter snow, his eyes wide and disbelieving. "Do you have any idea who you've been helping?" Tobias stared at Marshal Webb's terrified face, his mind spinning like a wagon wheel stuck deep in a mud bog. In 12 years of grinding, unforgiving frontier living, he'd never once seen the ruthless lawman, the man whose name struck fear into the hearts of outlaws and settlers alike, show an ounce of fear. Not from hardened criminals. Not from snarling wild animals. Not even from the Apache war parties that had, just last summer, swept through the territory, leaving 3 settlements burned to ash and countless lives shattered. But now, Webb looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, a specter of impossible dread. The wounded Indian spoke again, this time in perfect, unaccented English, his voice carrying an authority, a quiet, undeniable power that seemed to fill the entire ranch yard, silencing the very wind. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, a visible struggle. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked like a teenager's, thin and reedy. This is Iana. Son of Chief Takakota of the Northern Apache. He's the one who negotiated the peace treaty with Fort Richardson last spring. Tobias felt the very ground shift beneath his feet, a sudden, disorienting lurch. The peace treaty. The very same treaty that had, miraculously, halted 3 years of brutal, bloody warfare between the desperate settlers and the fierce Apache. The same treaty that had saved hundreds of lives on both sides, white and red. The same treaty that had, against all odds, made it safe, truly safe, for families to settle in this treacherous territory without the constant, gnawing fear of midnight raids, of sudden, brutal death. And he'd been watering the man who had made it all possible. But if Iana was a peacemaker, a man of such profound importance, why was he running from the law with a fresh bullet in his side? The question screamed in Tobias's mind. There was an ambush, Iana continued, his breathing still labored, each word a visible effort, yet his voice seemed to grow stronger, clearer with each passing moment. 3 days ago. A meeting with Colonel Morrison about expanding the treaty to include the Southern Territories. But Morrison had other plans. Webb's face went from pale to a sickly, unnatural gray. Colonel Morrison is dead. Shot in the back during an Indian attack 3 days ago. You're wanted for his murder. The accusation hung in the air, damning and absolute. Because that's what they want you to believe, Iana countered, pushing himself up straighter against the cold stone of the well, defiance burning in his dark eyes. Morrison wasn't killed by Indians. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Apache to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we would meet. The implications hit Tobias like a physical blow, a stunning revelation that stole his breath. Someone had staged Morrison's murder. To frame Iana. Someone who desperately wanted the hard-won peace treaty destroyed. Someone who wanted the territory to burn again, to plunge back into the bloody, lucrative chaos of war. Who? Webb rasped, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer, a dawning horror in his eyes. Iana's dark eyes hardened, like flint striking steel, a dangerous glint within them. The same men who've been selling guns to the renegade tribes. The same men who've been making a fortune off this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of looking for the real killers. Webb took a hesitant step backward, his hand moving unconsciously toward his weapon, then stopping, caught in a moral quicksand. You're talking about treason. About corruption in the territorial government. Those are serious accusations. And they'll remain accusations until I can prove them, Iana replied, his voice chillingly steady. Which is why they need me dead before I reach the Apache Council tomorrow. Why they put a bullet in me and left me for dead. Why they're counting on men like you to finish what they started. Tobias watched this electrifying exchange with growing dread. He'd thought he was just helping a wounded stranger, a simple act of human decency. Instead, he'd stumbled headlong into the suffocating, dangerous heart of a conspiracy that could tear the entire territory apart, consuming countless innocent lives in its wake. But what chilled him most, what sent a shiver of true terror down his spine, was the dawning realization that if Ayanna was telling the truth, if even a fraction of his incredible story was accurate, then Marshal Webb hadn't come here to arrest a fugitive. He'd come here to commit murder. A cold, calculated assassination, sanctioned by higher powers. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Webb's 5 men shifted nervously in their saddles, a ripple of unease moving through them. Hands hovered near their weapons, then dropped away, then returned, unsure. Their eyes darted nervously between their marshal, the embodiment of their authority, and the wounded Apache warrior who had just, with chilling calm, accused half the territorial government of murder and treason. Tobias could practically see the war raging behind Webb's eyes. The marshal was trapped, suspended precariously between duty and truth, between deeply ingrained orders and a suddenly awakened conscience. And men like Webb, men forged in the brutal fires of the frontier, didn't handle moral dilemmas well. They usually solved them with bullets. It was simpler. Cleaner. Even if what you're saying is true, Webb said slowly, his voice hoarse, a desperate attempt to cling to his crumbling world, I have my orders. You're wanted for Morrison's murder. I'm supposed to bring you back dead or alive. Dead would be more convenient, Ayanna replied, his voice steady despite the pain etched across his face, the stark lines of suffering. Dead men can't testify. Dead men can't reveal who really benefits from another Indian war. One of Webb's men, a young deputy with nervous, wide eyes, leaned forward in his saddle, a tremor of doubt in his voice. Marshal, if he's telling the truth about the peace treaty. Shut up, Bradley. Webb snapped, the words cracking like a whip. But Tobias could see it now, creeping into the marshal's expression like cracks in a dam wall, small at first, then widening, threatening to give way. Doubt. That's when Ayanna played his final, desperate card. With trembling fingers, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, stained with his own blood, a testament to the brutal journey it had taken. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Colonel Morrison. Written the night before he died. Webb stared at the letter as if it might burst into flames, his eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and a morbid fascination. What does it say? It says Morrison discovered who's been supplying weapons to the renegade tribes. Names. Dates. Amounts. Enough evidence to hang a dozen men. Ayanna's eyes never left Webb's face, holding his gaze with unwavering intensity. Including evidence that someone in the territorial marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words hit Webb like a physical blow, a crushing weight that stole his breath. His face went through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly, bilious green. Behind him, his men exchanged nervous, guilty glances, suddenly very interested in examining their horses' manes, their boots, anything to avoid the accusing glare that had just fallen on their commander. Tobias felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the rising tide of danger. He was witnessing something that could get them all killed, right here, right now. The precise, horrifying moment when a corrupt lawman realized, with sickening clarity, that his own neck was on the chopping block. You're lying, Webb said, but his voice lacked conviction, a desperate, hollow echo. Am I? Ayanna held up the blood-stained letter, a testament to the truth. Morrison trusted me enough to give me this the night he died. Told me to get it to Fort Richardson if anything happened to him. Said it was insurance. Webb took a predatory step forward, his hand now gripping his pistol, the leather creaking with the pressure. Give me that letter. So you can destroy it. Ayanna shook his head, a gesture of quiet defiance. I don't think so, Marshal. But I'll make you a deal. Let me live long enough to reach the Apache Council tomorrow, and I'll make sure your name isn't mentioned when this all comes to light. The offer hung in the air, thick and acrid, like smoke from a gunshot. Tobias could see Webb calculating the odds, weighing the risks, trying desperately to figure out which choice, which path, would keep him alive longer. A murderer for hire, caught in the jaws of his own treachery. But what happened next surprised everyone. Deputy Bradley, the young man with the nervous eyes, dismounted slowly, deliberately. He walked toward the well, his hands raised peacefully, a gesture of truce, of surrender to a higher truth. "Marshal," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "I've been thinking about something. Remember that shipment of rifles that went missing 3 months ago? The one we were told was stolen by Indians?" Webb's face darkened, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage in his eyes. "What about it?" "I saw those same rifles 2 weeks later in the hands of settlers heading south." Bradley's young face was flushed, either with a newfound courage or a terrifying fear, or perhaps both. "Made me wonder who was really stealing from who." The admission cracked something open in the group, a fissure in the foundation of their obedience. Suddenly, other deputies were nodding, sharing quick, meaningful glances, remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time. A missing payroll here, an unexplained skirmish there. And Tobias realized, with a jolt that went through him like an electric current, that Ayanna had just done something truly remarkable. Without firing a shot, without raising his voice, without even standing, he had turned Webb's own men against him. Webb wasn't the kind of man who went down without a fight, not ever. And when cornered, dangerous men did dangerous things. His hand tightened on his pistol grip until his knuckles went white, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous, Tobias thought, a cold dread washing over him. He could see the exact, terrifying moment when the marshal decided that bullets were simpler than truth. "You're all fools," Webb snarled, his mask of civility finally slipping away, revealing the ugly, brutal face beneath. "You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe the testimony of a dead Indian and a handful of traitors?" The deputies, a sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through them, spread out instinctively, hands moving toward their weapons. But Tobias could see the uncertainty in their faces, the deep-seated conflict in their eyes. Years, a lifetime, of following orders, of unquestioning loyalty, warred against the growing, undeniable realization that those orders, their very foundation of law, might be utterly, terribly wrong. Ayanna, with a monumental effort that drew a fresh bead of blood from his wound, struggled to his feet, using the rough stone well for support. Blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed them against his side, but his voice, though still strained, remained steady, ringing with an undeniable conviction. "The truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It just is. The truth," Webb spat, his voice thick with venom, "is that you murdered a United States Army officer, and I'm going to collect the bounty on your head." He drew his pistol in one smooth, practiced motion, the barrel swinging inexorably toward Ayanna's chest. But before he could fire, Deputy Bradley, his face pale but his jaw set with a sudden, fierce resolve, stepped directly into the line of fire. His own weapon, now drawn, was raised, aimed squarely at his commanding officer. "Stand down, Marshal." The words cracked like thunder across the ranch yard, echoing in the sudden, shocked silence. 4 other deputies, emboldened by Bradley's courage, followed his lead, their guns now trained on their own commanding officer. Only one man remained loyal to Webb, a grizzled veteran named Hawkins, whose face was as etched with corruption as his boss's. "You're making a mistake, boys," Webb said, though sweat now beaded on his forehead, betraying his sudden fear. "A mistake that'll cost you your badges. Maybe your lives." "Maybe," Bradley replied, his voice firm, unwavering. "But I've made enough mistakes following your orders. I won't make any more." Tobias watched this impossible standoff with growing dread, a knot tightening in his stomach. 6 armed men in his ranch yard, all pointing guns at each other, all convinced, in their own way, they were in the right. This was how range wars started. This was how good men died for bad reasons, for causes they barely understood. That's when Ayana did something utterly unexpected. He began to sing. Not in English, but in Apache, a low, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the very earth itself, ancient and resonant. The words, foreign and ethereal, carried across the ranch like wine through canyon walls, speaking of honor and sacrifice, of brothers who stood together against the encroaching darkness, of a spirit that could not be broken. The effect was immediate and startling. The deputies lowered their weapons slightly, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. They didn't understand the words, but they felt their power, their raw, undeniable emotion. Even Webb seemed momentarily mesmerized by the strange, beautiful sound, his pistol wavering, his eyes unfocused. And while they listened, transfixed by the ancient song, Ayana was doing something else entirely. He was calling to his people. The song was a signal, a message carried on the evening wind to ears that knew how to listen, ears honed by generations of living in harmony with the vast, silent land. Tobias realized this with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. Ayana wasn't just singing. He was summoning. The melody ended, fading into the gathering twilight, and silence, heavy and expectant, fell over the ranch like a funeral shroud. But in that silence, Tobias heard something that made his blood run cold. Hoofbeats. Distant, yes, but growing closer. Many hoofbeats. Moving fast. Webb heard them too. His face went pale as moonlight, the last vestiges of color draining away. How many? He rasped, his voice barely a whisper of fear. Ayana smiled, a ghost of a smile, despite his pain, despite the blood still oozing from his side. Enough. The sound grew louder, multiplying, until it sounded like thunder rolling across the plains. Not 6 riders this time. Not even a dozen. An entire Apache war party was riding toward Tobias's ranch, and they would arrive within minutes. Webb raised his pistol again, his hand trembling, his eyes wide with a desperate, trapped animal's rage. This time, he pointed it directly at Tobias's chest. You did this. You helped him signal them. I gave a dying man water, Tobias replied, surprised by the steady calmness of his own voice, despite the gun pointed at his heart. Same as I do for any creature suffering on my land. The hoofbeats were close enough now to feel in the ground beneath their feet, a rhythmic tremor that vibrated through the very earth. Close enough to count, but there were too many. Far too many to count. And Webb, finally, terrifyingly, understood what Ayana had been planning all along. He had walked, open-eyed, into a trap of his own making. They came over the horizon like a vision from another world, a silent, powerful tide. 50 Apache warriors on horseback, moving in perfect, synchronized formation, their war paint gleaming like ancient jewels in the dying sunlight, a stark contrast to the grim, dust-choked reality of the frontier. But as they drew closer, Tobias realized something that defied everything he thought he knew about Indian war parties, about the relentless, brutal warfare he'd come to expect. They weren't coming for battle. At the head of the formidable group rode an elderly chief, his presence radiating an undeniable authority that commanded respect from 100 yards away. His long, gray hair, braided with sacred eagle feathers, cascaded down his back, a testament to his years and wisdom. And despite his age, he sat his horse with the profound dignity of a man who had never, not once, bowed to anyone. Behind him rode warriors of every age, from seasoned, scarred fighters to young, eager braves barely old enough to carry weapons. But their weapons remained sheathed, nestled in their quivers, holstered in their belts. This was not a charge. This was an arrival. Webb's face cycled through a spectrum of emotions, confusion, stark fear, and a desperate, frantic calculation. He still held his pistol, aimed uselessly at Tobias's chest, but his hand shook like a man racked with fever, the weapon wavering in his unsteady grip. This changes nothing. I still have my orders, he blurted out, a pathetic, desperate attempt to cling to the shreds of his authority. Your orders, came a new voice, calm and clear, cutting through Webb's pathetic bluster, are no longer valid. Everyone turned to see Deputy Bradley, his spine now ramrod straight, holding up an official-looking document, crisp and white against the dimming light. "This came through this morning, Marshal. Direct from the Territorial Governor. All pursuit of Ayanna is suspended, pending investigation into Colonel Morrison's death." Webb's face went purple with rage, a horrifying, apoplectic flush. "You lying piece of—" "Check your own dispatch pouch," Bradley interrupted, his voice firm, unwavering. "Unless you've been too busy collecting bounties to read your official mail." The Apache riders formed a wide, silent circle around the ranch, a living, breathing enclosure. Not threatening, no, but unmistakably present, a silent, powerful force. Their chief dismounted slowly, gracefully, and walked with measured steps toward the well where his son waited. With each step, the old man's eyes never left Ayanna's face, searching for signs of serious injury, his expression a mixture of profound relief and deep concern. When father and son embraced, a collective sigh seemed to rise from the assembled warriors, a silent exhalation of shared relief, a profound moment of human connection. Tobias found himself witnessing something sacred, something profoundly intimate. The reunion of a leader with his people, a father with his child, a peace negotiator with those he'd sworn to protect. The chief spoke to his son in rapid, urgent Apache, his weathered hands gently checking the wound, his face grave with concern. Ayanna responded in the same fluid language, but Tobias caught enough English mixed in, enough familiar words, to understand the gist, the truth. The conspiracy. The names of the real killers. When the hushed, intense conversation ended, the chief turned to face Webb, his eyes like black diamonds, hard and ancient. When he spoke, his English was perfect, precise, each word carrying the weight of centuries. "Marshal Webb," the chief said, his voice calm, yet resonating with an undeniable power, "my son tells me you came here to murder him." Webb's pistol wavered, his facade crumbling. "I came here to arrest a fugitive." "A fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied, his voice laced with contempt. "A man whose only crime was discovering how you and your friends have been profiting from war between our peoples." The accusation hung in the air, thick and acrid, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Webb's last remaining ally, the grizzled veteran Hawkins, was slowly backing his horse away from the circle, his eyes darting wildly, clearly calculating his chances of escape. "You have no proof," Webb said, his voice cracking on the words, a desperate, pathetic plea. The chief smiled, not warmly, but with the chilling satisfaction of a man holding all the cards, a man who had already won. "We have Morrison's letter. We have the testimony of the Real killers, who confessed everything before they died trying to escape our justice. And we have something else." He gestured to one of his warriors, who rode forward, a silent, imposing figure, carrying a leather satchel. From it, the warrior produced a stack of papers that made Webb's face go ashen, a deathly pallor. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued, his voice a low, implacable rumble. "Every payment. Every shipment. Every lie you told to cover your tracks. Morrison was more thorough than you knew." Webb's world collapsed in that moment, shattering around him like fragile glass. Tobias watched, mesmerized, as a corrupt man, a powerful man, realized with sickening clarity that all his schemes, all his violence, all his betrayals had been for nothing. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses reliable. The justice inevitable. But cornered animals were unpredictable. Dangerous. Webb, driven by a primal, desperate rage, swung his pistol toward the chief, common sense and self-preservation overridden by a savage, suicidal instinct. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." What happened next moved faster than thought, a blur of desperate motion. Ayanna, despite his grievous wound, threw himself between the gun and his father, a testament to his boundless courage, his unwavering loyalty. The pistol fired, a deafening crack that split the air, and 50 Apache warriors, a single, unified force, reached for their weapons in perfect, terrifying unison. But the shot went wild, burying itself harmlessly in the dirt. Because Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had only wanted to help a thirsty man, had tackled Marshall Webb from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground in a tangled, dusty heap of rage and despair. The dust settled slowly, like a curtain falling on the final, brutal act of a play. Webb lay motionless beneath Tobias, his pistol, wrenched from his grasp, thrown clear by the impact. Deputy Bradley and his men, moving with grim efficiency, quickly secured both Webb and Hawkins, their faces set with a grim satisfaction, a quiet sense of duty finally done. The Apache warriors, their faces impassive, slowly lowered their weapons, the tension in the air gradually dissipating, replaced by a profound, almost sacred calm. But it was what happened next that would stay with Tobias, etched into his memory, for the rest of his life. The chief, Iana's father, walked slowly to where Tobias sat, catching his breath in the dirt, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The old man's weathered face, a roadmap of years lived hard and seen much, showed no immediate expression as he studied this white rancher, this stranger who had risked everything for a man he didn't know, for a truth that was not his own. Then, without warning, he placed both hands on Tobias's shoulders, a gesture of profound gravity. He spoke in Apache, his voice low and resonant, words that carried the weight of ceremony, of honor, of recognition. Iana translated, his voice thick with emotion, raw with gratitude. He says, "You are now brother to our people. That what you did today, showing mercy to an enemy, risking your life for truth, choosing courage over fear, these are the actions of a true warrior." Tobias felt something shift deep in his chest, something profound and elemental, like a heavy door opening to let in a light he'd never seen before. All his life, he'd been taught that Indians were savages, enemies, obstacles to civilization, something to be eradicated, certainly never to be trusted. But looking into the chief's ancient, wise eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a kind of profound, unspoken respect he had never, not once, earned from his own people. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Tobias had ever witnessed, a quiet, solemn ritual bathed in the last, lingering rays of the setting sun. The Apache warriors dismounted, their faces stern and respectful, and formed a wide, unbroken circle around him. One by one, they approached Tobias, their movements deliberate, unhurried. They touched his hand, not a handshake in the white man's fashion, but something deeper, a recognition of kinship that transcended skin color, that defied culture, that spoke of shared humanity. When the last warrior had paid his respects, the chief presented Tobias with a gift that took his breath away, a tangible symbol of their acceptance. A war lance, its shaft worn smooth by generations of hands, decorated with sacred eagle feathers and intricate beadwork that shimmered in the fading light. "This belonged to my grandfather," the chief explained, his voice low and resonant with history, and his grandfather before him. "It has never been carried by anyone not born Apache. Until today." As the sun sank slowly over the western mountains, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of gold and crimson, the Apache prepared to depart, their mission accomplished, their truth vindicated. Iana's wound had been properly treated by the tribal medicine man, a swift, practiced application of herbs and bandages. And though he was still weak, still pale, he would live to see the peace treaty expanded and the real conspirators, the architects of war and greed, brought to justice. Before mounting his horse, Iana clasped Tobias's hand one final time, his grip strong and true. "You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples." "I just gave a thirsty man some water," Tobias replied, a quiet humility in his voice. Iana smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile now, one that reached his dark, intelligent eyes. "Sometimes," he said, his gaze sweeping over the vast, darkening plains, "that's how the world changes. One cup of water at a time." 24 hours later, exactly as the title had promised, they were gone. The Apache war party had vanished as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind only the faintest impression in the dust, a whisper of a powerful presence. But they left behind something far more precious, far more lasting, undeniable proof that in a world consumed by hatred and fear, by the endless cycle of violence and suspicion, simple human decency could still work miracles. Webb and Hawkins, stripped of their authority, their corruption exposed, were tried and convicted of treason, of egregious corruption, and of conspiracy to commit murder. The insidious gun-running operation, a festering wound on the frontier, was dismantled, its tentacles severed. And the peace treaty, so nearly shattered, was not only renewed but expanded, stretching its protective blanket to include all the tribes of the territory, ushering in a new era of fragile but hopeful coexistence. And Tobias Hartwell, a simple rancher who had shown mercy to a stranger, a solitary man who had made a choice based not on fear but on profound, quiet courage, became the first white man in territorial history to be formally adopted into the Apache Nation. Because sometimes, in the brutal, unforgiving landscape of the Old West, the greatest battles weren't won with guns or with violence, not with cunning or with force. They were won with something far more powerful, something that echoed with the ancient wisdom of the land itself, the courage to see enemies as human beings, and the profound, transformative wisdom to choose compassion over fear.